Hello, humanity. Welcome back to the We Are Not Lonely podcast. Initially, I thought I'd do this extempo once again, but it is going to be primarily extempo, but there's going to be a little bit of structure as well this time. Starting off, I'd just like to say that I've reached a particular point in my life, by which I mean I've completed my Jyotish course. For those of you who don't know, I started studying Jyotish under the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan chapter in Mysore almost in 2018. It's actually a 3-year course, and I had completed my exams of my final Jyotisha Acharya sometime towards the end of 2021. That's when I finished my exams and submitted my paper. I took a great deal of time to work on my thesis for this particular thing. I took my own sweet time, as one would say. But that's finally done. I was actually researching one of my favorite topics, probably my most favorite topic ever. If I had to rank a bunch of things from top to bottom, this would be right on top of the list. I'm not gonna quite reveal what it's about. I'm just gonna say one word and just leave it. No, I'm not gonna tease you like that. So the concept is about pralaya. It's like the concept literally means the end of the world, destruction, dissolution, etc. And that's what I've been studying, more or less. I had actually completed my project like really early. I was one of the first to complete it, but I just took my own sweet time submitting it. I had completed the entire thesis sometime in April, March. There's been minimal improvement, shall we say, retyping, editing since then, which should kind of tell you that how good I am. Okay, so essentially what I've done is I've been studying this particular thing called Jyotisha, which for the lack of a better description, I suppose I would say it's Vedic astrology, but it's not really Vedic astrology. I mean, technically it's considered a Vedanga, it's considered a limb of the Vedas. It's sort of derived from the Vedas, but Vedic astrology is a huge misnomer. The actual term is Jyotisha or Hora. And the word Jyotisha is a compound word that's composed of two smaller words, Jyoti, which means light, and Isha, which means Lord. Essentially, that means Jyotisha is Jyotisha, the Lord of Light, study of light, and with special reference to the luminaries, the grahas, which we generally refer to as planets, but that again is another misnomer. It's graha, not planet. And the nakshatras, the asterisms, the constellations, and so on and so forth. The other name is kind of awkward from a grammatical perspective. Ahoratre is supposed to mean both day and night, and hora is, we get the word hora from dropping a and re, which leaves us with ahora tre. You drop a and tre, which leaves you with hora. But generally speaking, this is not a practice that is generally done. It's a very weird naming system that I've never seen before, to be fair. Alright? Anyway, getting back to what I was talking about, I finally completed my Jyotisha course, and the good thing is I actually submitted my paper, my thesis, on the 22nd of Jan, which is really cool. The date sort of added up to 20. It was 22/01/23, so 22 plus 1, 23. It's really stupid, I know, but it was funny, and I just wanted to mention it. I just thought I'd talk about this for this podcast because I'm going to be preparing to teach people now. That's the other thing. I'm going to be teaching Jyotish here for at least 6 to 7 months. I'm going to be teaching general astrology for nearly 6 to 7 months in Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. If you'd like to check it out, please visit in person, I guess, and become a student. It'll be fun. I mean, I'm gonna have fun for sure. So, getting to Jyotish, I've already mentioned that it's essentially a Vedanga, it's a limb of the Vedas, and it's considered the eye. It's given a great deal of importance in the entire tradition of the Vedangas. And the point of astrology, the Vedic astrology, the Jyotish, it's to guide people. If you've listened to my 2 podcasts about the Shastras, I had 2 particular podcasts that quite explained what the Shastras are, where they come from, and what they're all about. I spoke about the Vedas and so on and so forth in that. The point is, there are these Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Generally speaking, most of humanity is concerned with Dharma, Artha, and Kama. A small summary of that entire podcast: Dharma can be equated to invisible wealth as well as doing things in the right manner, the morals. But it's a little more complicated than that. Dharma is a little more complicated than just morals. But in this particular context, when we look at it as a goal of humans, Purushartha means literally human goals. Dharma refers to this invisible wealth, which is also known as punyam, and the ways to acquire and accrue this invisible wealth. Artha refers to roti, kapda, makan, literally food, clothing, and shelter, the basic necessities of every human being. Roti, kapda, makan. That's Artha represents the basic necessities of every human. Kama, which is generally understood to be desire, here represents the pleasures, the finer things in life. Not necessarily pleasures, but it can also cover that, obviously. Generally speaking, Dharma, Artha, Kama. Other things that are called Preyaha. Now the 4th Purushartha is called Moksha. Moksha means liberation. And one of the things you're looking for moksha from is the dependence on Preyaha. And this part is called Shreyaha. Alright? So the Vedas itself, generally speaking, deal with the Chatur Purushartha, the 4 Purusharthas, and how one can pursue them in one's life. Since Jyotisha is a Vedanga, it literally is an extension of this. Okay? So it generally speaks about Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. The general idea is that people pursuing moksha believe that they look at Preyaha as bondage. We are enslaved by the material, by either the presence of an object or the absence of an object. The presence of an object causes one to become addicted to it, and the absence of an object causes one to miss that, and essentially in their mind they're always longing for that object. And these are how the material things actually cause bondage, attachment, so on and so forth. Moksha is the liberation. You're free from that. Gaining mastery over the state of mind, over the presence of an object or the absence of an object, makes you a Swami. If you are ensnared by this, you are a Dasa. Okay. So this, even in the Vedas, there are 2 schools of thought. There are multiple schools of thought. Actually, there are Dvadasha Darshanani, 12 philosophies, 12 schools of thought which speak about the ultimate. And in that, the Vedic tradition has 6. The first, there are Chaturveda Bauddha and Jaina darshanas, there's Charvaka and so on and so forth. There are a bunch of darshanas which are basically multiple ways of understanding reality. Alright. Getting back to our point, which is Jyotishya, since the Vedas talk about all of this, Jyotishya also concerns itself with the Purusharthas. The point of Jyotishya is to guide a being as to their destiny. Not quite, it's a little more complicated than that, but we'll get to that, right? There are certain theories that we must first understand before we really go into this entire concept, one of which is the concept of karma. It's a word that's severely misunderstood and severely misrepresented in the modern world. It's actually a Sanskrit word which means action, and it is penetrated pretty much every language. It's known across the world, especially in the West, and they just say, this is my karma, that is my karma, so on and so forth, without really understanding what the word karma means. Okay. I'm actually reading a book on karma by... I'll talk about that in one of my videos. It's a book by Sadhguru. And I'm actually making a lot of notes as to how the classical understanding is quite different from his understanding. But I'll get to that in a separate video later. Okay? So the whole thing about Jyotishya, the idea is unmapping a person's karma and karma phala. The idea is that every effect has a cause. Action leads to reaction. And unmapping this, understanding why certain things are happening in a person's life, that is the purview of Jyotishya. That is the domain of Jyotishya. Now, I come from a land where the tradition of astrology is quite different. From a preliminary reading of this book called Karma by Sadhguru, Mr. Jaggi Vasudev, I've understood that he doesn't quite put a great deal of stock into Jyotishas or astrology. He, like many others, call it a quack science. It's a hoax. They call it a hoax. While at the same time, he talks about how his lived experience is so important, and his understanding is not the classical understanding, but more of the lived experience and he calls himself a yogi. And that his lived experience is what is guiding him on this understanding of karma. So, since he has made this particular point, I'm just going to go ahead. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm bashing on him. I do not agree with his philosophies. I agree with his actions. There's a lot of things. I believe he's a mixed bag. There are certain things that you can accept. Certain things I vehemently disagree with. Moving on. Again, you'll find out more about that in the video when I'm finally done reading Karma, and we'll talk about that at length over there. Alright? Cool. The interesting part is I've actually been a skeptic for most of my life. Initially, for a very long time, as a matter of fact. I think I was about 20 years old before I finally started to look beyond just the material. I was an agnostic for most of my life. I didn't particularly believe. Even after my Brahma Upadesham, I was just mechanically performing certain things. The rituals that I was prescribed to perform, the ones that I had earned the right to perform, supposedly, after I got my Brahma Upadesham done. But until a certain point, I had a tipping point when I met a person who quite literally might have sparked a change in my life. And that was actually the choir master in Christ University. I'm just going to mention his first name, Mr. Jason. He was the choir master, and after a particular conversation with him, it really got me thinking. He asked me if I had ever thought about finding God. And my first response at that particular moment was very arrogant, but it was on the inside. And I clamped down on it because I knew he was being very genuine about this entire thing. He asked me, and I had gone to him for help, by the way. He asked me, have you thought about finding God? My my rather arrogant response in my head was, I was tempted to respond with, no, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in God, I believe in science. But I put that down and I didn't really say it. And I suppose that thing really stayed with me. And that's where my quest sort of began. You know, that's all he had to do. He just asked me that question, have you thought about finding God? And those last two words, finding God, finding God, find God, find God, sort of sunk into my mind. And it prompted this huge, drastic change. Now, this was a process that went on for a while. I'm not going to talk about it here, but that's where the journey began sometime in 2014, 2013, 14. I was still in the choir at that point, so it was the financial year of 2013, 14, yeah. It was the academic year of that time. 12 to 13 was my first year, 13 to 14 was my second year, at which point I was still in the choir. Um, 12 to 13, 13 to 14, and 14 to 15 I wasn't part of the choir. I had quit at that time. I tried it out, it didn't really... I just got distracted. I didn't want to do the same thing I had been doing for the past 2 years. I wanted something different, I guess. And so I left the choir. I don't necessarily regret it, but I do wonder. It was... The time I spent in the choir was one of my happiest. I got to sing every single day, 5 times a week. Of course, at that particular time, I had my a cappella group. I was part of an a cappella group, which I'm not going to mention since most of us have gone in different ways. But we did have practice on a daily basis. I think, though, it would have been nice if I still maintained. I don't know. It's too late to do anything about that now, though. Right. So, getting back to what I was saying, that was the moment my journey began. I was a skeptic. I was an agnostic until that point. I mean, I was bordering on the atheistic agnostic side, and that firmly moved me into the agnostic side, you know? And people may wonder, hey, what are you saying? What do you mean? There's no agnostic side. There's no theistic side of the agnostic. This is my understanding, right? So on the atheistic side, you've got a person who literally says, hey, you know what? There is no God. There's a certain amount of conviction in that. For an atheist, there's like, maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. And a theist obviously says there is a God. Alright, so this is the classical three-person theory, I guess, with respect to God. Now, going into this, let's explore the agnost. My theory is that there are three shades here as well, if you look into it a little deeper. So there's the firmly sort of more leaning towards the atheistic side. There probably isn't a God. That's one. In the middle we have, I don't know if there's a God or not. And on the other side, there's this person who's like, there probably is a God. And then, of course, on the other side, you bring this all under the agnostic thing because they're not very firm in their convictions, but you have people leaning either one way or the other, or they're firmly in the camp of agnost. So what happened at this particular time was I moved from the there probably isn't a God to the I don't know if there's a God or not. And my journey started there, and over time, I moved to the camp of there is a God. I'm not going to talk about those particular things, but I'm not going to talk about my findings and all of that. I don't know if this is the right platform for that yet, but we shall see. When the time comes, I will reveal the things that I had gone through, the experiences, and so on and so forth. There were certain things that I went through that had me questioning reality, that had me questioning everything that I thought I knew, and I began exploring this topic with a great deal of zeal, a great deal of open mindedness, I guess you could say. Right? And so that was essentially my journey from atheism to theism. At the same time, for a very long time, I had actually been what we call a non believer in a bunch of things. As a child, I've seen certain Jyotish rituals. I had seen rituals being performed at my house for a very long time. I've always been going to temples, even though I was an agnost, not a firm atheist. Although at a particular time I was a firm atheist for a while. And then, I had my entire journey. As I grew up, I started to question my own beliefs and why I believed such a thing. Now I'm firmly on the side of there is God, Ishwaraha Asti. At the same time, my doubts, the way initially I used to believe all of this Jyotisha thing was hokam. It was purely nonsensical. It was not what we call real. It was just make believe. And I used to disparage it. I say, what is this superstitious thing that all of you are believing in? I used to ask my mom that. We've had this family astrologer for as long as I can remember. The earliest memories I have of them are easily 2003, 2004. I might have met them even before that because they've been associated with us for a very long time. I've known this particular astrologer, this Panikar, as they would call it in Kerala, which is where they're from. He belongs to the Panikar family, which is literally an astrologer family, so to speak. And my attitude towards this subject also underwent this tremendous transformation as time passed. I was a person who once disparaged astrology as superstition, bunkum, hokum, nonsense, a way to trick gullible people into shelling out money. Now I'm going to be teaching astrology in Bharati Vidya Bhavan from next week. This is one hell of a transformation. How and why? I had this huge transformation, a huge expansion of my beliefs. And now I'm firmly on the side of astrology. I definitely not just believe, I know for a fact it's not just mere superstition. I know the general arguments towards astrology. Typewriters, monkeys, infinite typewriters, infinite monkeys, so on and so forth. That's the idea is that if you have an infinite number of monkeys with an infinite number of typewriters and they're just hammering away, eventually there's a possibility that they will churn out Shakespeare. Eventually there's a possibility that one of the monkeys will churn out Shakespeare. They will hit the keys in the right order that will produce all of the works of Shakespeare. There's a possibility if you look at infinity. That's the idea behind this whole thing. Alright, so my point here is that I myself have witnessed this particular art, this particular science, this divine thing. And I can say without a doubt that it's not superstition. Of course, this is going to throw me into the limelight of all of the intellectuals, all of the rationalists who say, how can you believe in it? So on and so forth. Of course, I could cop out and just quote from this Sadhguru. This is my lived experience. I have seen things. I have actually seen heard, witnessed things that have firmly moved me from the camp of atheism slash agnosticism to theism. So, you know what? I'll just go into the whole situation with Jyotisha, I guess. Since I haven't really done it, I haven't really gone into it. My interest in Jyotisha began sometime in 2017, and interestingly enough, it actually looking back at my horoscope, at the transit of the charts, and so on and so forth, it happened in a particular time where it was ripe. If I say this, I don't think it will particularly make a sense. I don't think this particular statement is going to make sense except to a person who has studied Jyotisha. So I had this rather interesting experience with a certain individual, which I'm not going to talk about now. I will do it in the future, eventually, when the time arrives. And that prompted me to start looking into this particular subject a little more, with a little more detail. Interestingly, the Jyotishers will appreciate this little information. This was sometime in 2017. I'm not particularly sure about the date, as in the month and the day that this interest started to blossom, but the interesting part is in the latter half of, at least in the last couple of months, post October, Jupiter was transiting Libra, which is called Tula Rashi in the Vedic system. It was transiting the 8th house from my natal chart. That generally represents a certain. The 8th house represents, among other things, the occult, which Jyotisha definitely is. It's an occult science. Occult means hidden, it's not necessarily black magic and all of that. And at the same time, I started developing a certain interest in other subjects as well, such as the Vedas and Jyotisha, Sanskrit, so on and so forth. It's a very interesting time, and correlating everything that had happened in my life, it kind of makes sense. It makes a lot of sense for me personally because I understand the subject. That's when my interest began. It's been nearly 6 years since then. I've kind of studied a little bit of the subject, but most of this was without any formal guidance. Now, my formal guidance began in 2018 when I joined Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, where they teach Jyotisha in a very scientific manner. They teach the principles. The thing about Jyotisha is you're attempting to uncover the fate of an individual through certain patterns, as below, so above, basically. So our body is affected by the cosmic movements of this vast interplanetary, this cosmic drama. And certain people will say, hey, you know what? That's weird. Doesn't that, since the movement of the planets and so on and so forth are fixed, does that essentially mean that this is a very compelling argument, actually, the movement of the stars and things through space are fixed. So does that mean there's no free will? It seems sort of stupid to say that, hey, you know what, I can look at the movement of the stars and planets and predict what is going to happen in the future. Right? This is a very legitimate argument. And my counter to this argument is we're looking at things from the perspective of Earth. From the frame of our reference is Earth. And if you map them onto this thing called the zodiac and you start analyzing the chart, we start seeing certain patterns. And my entire thesis was devoted to the patterns that started to emerge when I started mapping the movement of certain planets, two particular planets, Jupiter and Saturn, which are called Guru and Shani in the Vedic system. I basically went ahead and did this study of what was happening every time Guru and Shani entered a particular position in the zodiac. And I've got rather interesting results, shall I say. I'm not going to talk about that today. Eventually, I will come out and talk about what all I had spoken about, but not today. It seems weird, I understand. How on earth can the movement of stars and planets so far away affect us here on earth? All I'm going to say is that as a species where we are primarily focused on the material, what we can see and what we can measure, which is useful, of course. And in the past, actually, there was this particular school of thought called the Charvaka thought, which did the same thing. They rejected anything that they could not see for themselves. Or they could not, logic. They couldn't understand by way of logic, they see or infer. For example, like you can't really see air, but you can infer its presence by certain things. There's wind and so on and so forth. So the Charvaka is essentially a materialist school of thought that focuses on everything that can be seen, heard, experienced, and so on and so forth, right? But we actually forget the fact that the human senses are limited. And by this I mean that we have 5 senses. Each of them perform within a certain spectrum. We see a very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum from a certain frequency to another certain frequency. That is what is visible to us. We see a small narrow band of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Again, when it goes to hearing, we can hear between a certain range. There's an upper limit, there's a lower limit. Now, likewise, extrapolating onto the rest of the senses, we have certain limitations. So the end understanding is that our senses, the means by which we receive information about the outside world, about the universe, this input is limited by the limitations of the senses. So, if the input itself is limited, if the data that we receive is limited, how can we use that to understand the infinite? If we receive finite information, how can we understand the infinite? Right? There are certain things that are beyond our senses. There are certain things that are currently beyond our measurement. Okay? And in such things, the idea is that we bow to another authority. And that is the logic where the Vedas are said to be Apaurusheya Pramanam. Paurusheya Pramanam is essentially anything that is cognized by a human. Okay? You get information from the 5 senses, and using that you theorize a bunch of things. You come up with all sorts of logics, etc., etc. But it's limited. I've just spoken about it. Your 5 senses are limited, and that is what we call Purusha Buddhi Dosha. The only way for us to overcome this Purusha Buddhi Dosha is to get information from a source that is Apaurusheya, that is not bound by the limitations of the human senses, that is not subject to Purusha Buddhi Dosha. And that is where the idea that the Vedas are Apaurusheya Pramanam, that they were revealed scriptures to the sages, comes in. And that's the importance of this particular fact. And here again, you actually have a choice. I've spoken about this in the Vedic podcast, in the podcast about the Shastras, but you actually have a choice whether to accept the fact that this is Apaurusheya Pramanam. You can choose to accept or reject. There is no, you will be cast into a burning pit of hellfire if you do not accept this. None of that. There is no such thing in the Shastras where you are thrown into a pit of burning hellfire just because you choose to accept or reject certain things. I just wanted to make that clear. You are free to reject the fact that the Vedas are Apaurusheya Pramana. There are certain philosophies that have actually done this. Such as, I think one of them would be the Charvaka philosophy. There's another atheistic philosophy, which if I remember correctly, is probably the Sankhya philosophy. There are certain philosophies that accept a small part and reject a small part. They are neither here nor there. They accept some part of the Vedas where it enhances, they accept the parts of the Veda that agree with their conclusion. They reject the parts of the Vedas that disagree with their conclusions. So this is the beauty of the Vedic Shastras, the Vedic the Darshanani, the philosophy that has come from, accepting or rejecting the Vedas and so on and so forth. So that's about it. You know what? I'm thinking of stopping it here. I've done this extempo. I've gone all around the world on this particular topic. As far as speaking about Jyotisha, I went through this whole journey that I went through as a child and my eventual transformation and understanding my movement from atheism to theism and so on and so forth. Basically, it's qualification saying, hey bro, listen, I used to be an atheist. I used to think I knew better, and now I've become a theist, and this is why I had this huge transformational experience, and I'm not a fool, so therefore, why don't you take me seriously? That's basically my argument. Oh, look at this, the way the human mind works, dude. It's very interesting. Anyway, I think I will end it there. This was rather interesting. Again, it's quite interesting to do things extempo and see where things lead. So this was a good one. So, do leave a like, share, subscribe. Let me know what you thought about this particular podcast. And I will see you again next week. Ta-ta, bye-bye. Until next time.